Welcome to Hands and Eyes. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. Deuteronomy 6:8. I'm Mark Horn, here the author of this book, The Victory According to Mark, and I want to talk to you about the healing pattern in Mark's Gospel, Part 2. Part 1, in our last lesson, we saw 4 double cycles in Mark 1 through 10. And here they are. The only way you'll make sense of this is if you've seen the previous video. So if you haven't watched that yet, please go to that now. But these cycles of healings also involve callings. So the first double cycle, it starts off with Jesus calling 4 men from their work by the sea. He calls them by name. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. The fact that they're by the sea does not even seem that important to you because they're fishermen. Where else would they be? And then Jesus heals 4 people. 4 called, 4 healed. Then, next part of the double cycle, alright, the last person healed, of course, those 4 is the paralytic who's made to walk. Then, Jesus calls Levi from his money table, which also is by the sea. Now, why is it mentioned then? Well, it reminds you of the other time that Jesus called 4 from their work to a new work. So Jesus calls one, and then he heals one. He restores the withered hand, so the man who can walk is now complemented by the man who has his hand back. Whole person, remember, from the previous video. Well, then the next cycle starts, and Jesus calls men by 8 new names. All right, he calls the 12 on a mountain. Again, we're told it's by the sea. Strange, but it reminds you again. Now, Levi's name, he was a tax gatherer. He's called Matthew now, as we know him from the gospel by that name. And so you have, even though you have 7 new people, you've already had 5 introduced, you have 8 new names, and you have 8 people healed in the rest of Mark's Gospel. I think there's more to it. I think there are some kinds of callings that go in front of all these healing cycles, each one, these double cycles, but still, that shows you that something has got to be going on. The theology of Mark's structure seems pretty simple. Those whom God calls through Christ, he also restores. I mean, how are we going to serve him if he doesn't restore us? So he restores us, he forgives us, he takes care of us, he heals us. So we are fully functioning again. Alright, let's look at the last 5 healing miracles. Just like we did before, I think this time we'll be able to use it again to show something else. To show how there's healings at each part of these double cycles, and these healings are actually kind of callings for each part of these that go into these healing cycles are twin callings. Okay. I have this, as I had it before, as 2 bullet points. And let me put some references here, some passages from Scripture, just so we know where things happen. The restoration of the first blind man is chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. Exorcism of the deaf-mute son is 9, 14 through 23. And then the restoration of the blind man is 10, 46 through 52. Okay. Now, let's make this pairs of bullet points, just to make it a little bit more clear here. Alright, double cycles and pairs of bullet points. So, right before the restoration of the blind man, we have this, and it's right after the exorcism of the deaf-mute son, or not right after, excuse me, but anyway, right before the restoration of the blind man, we have this, that on the way to Jerusalem, Jesus has to tell them the Son of Man has to suffer. James and John don't get it, and that causes a whole problem, and Jesus has to do some teaching. Now, could that be the calling that goes with the restoration of the blind man? Well, look at this. On the way, the Son of Man has to suffer. This happens right after the restoration of the first blind man. All right, 8:22 to 26, we have a man who's healed in 2 stages, interestingly enough. And then the next thing is Jesus reveals himself to his disciples, and that the Son of Man is going to suffer. That's the first time he's mentioned it. And Peter doesn't get it. You know, Peter is often included with James and John. Peter, James, and John. That's all over Mark's Gospel. So in the first instance, when they're on the way, the Son of Man Jesus says the Son of Man has to suffer and be crucified, and Peter tries to rebuke him after at first acknowledging who he is, and Jesus has to rebuke Peter. He doesn't get it. So then you have that, and then it goes on to the exorcism of the deaf-mute son, and then you have right after that, or soon after that, you have on the way the Son of Man has to suffer again, and this time it's James and John. These are parallel instances, and they look like twin callings. Now, let's look a little bit further. If we look at the passage of the first deaf mute who's healed. This is on the this is earlier in chapter 7. And look at then the restoration of the blind man after that. What we find is right after the restoration of the deaf mute, you have the feeding of the 4,000 in chapter 8, 1 through 10. All right? Now, again, the question here is, are there twin callings? Remember, that's how it started out, right? We had the calling of the four from their work by the sea, and we had the calling of the one from his work by the sea. So the last things here we have is on the way the Son of Man has to suffer. We have that twice. Here we have the feeding of the 4,000. Well, Mark's gospel is the only gospel that has two miraculous feedings, where a huge group of people is fed by multiplying the amount of bread through some kind of miraculous intervention. The feeding of the 4,000, but first there's the feeding of the 5,000. The 5,000, remember, are fed with 5 loaves and 2 fishes. The 4,000 are fed with, I think, 7 loaves. So you have this, and it seems to work out really nicely. You have these twin callings for the double cycles in these healing patterns. So looking at the entire thing then, let's again go from 4 bullet points to basically bullet points and sub-bullet points. So we have 8 of them. All right. 4 called by the sea, 1 called by the sea. That's the first double cycle. Disciples are called, the 12 are called in that mountain, and we'll talk about that some more when we think about it. But 5,000 fed, 4,000 fed. On the way, the Son of Man, on the way, the Son of Man. The ESV, by the way, I think says road in one of those cases, but it's on the way. It's the same word. So you have these double cycles are filled out with, they begin by callings that precede the exorcisms that precede, at least the first of the double cycles, it starts with an exorcism. So what do we do with that? What do we do with that second double cycle? Disciples are on the mountain, they're called, the 12 are called, and then we have Jairus' daughter raised from dead. And, before that, of course, we have the woman with the issue of blood. We have the leper. Excuse me, the leper is from earlier. I'm sorry. Anyway, okay. But what do we do? Oh yeah, it's the demoniac, the Gerasene demoniac. He's healed from his legion of demons. Okay, so those are the 3 in that part. But what do we do with that? What complements the raising the daughter? We already said it couldn't be complemented, but maybe we'll learn something different here. So disciples are called, in chapter 3, and then restoration from death, Jairus' daughter. And then what happens next? Well, let's look at the calling. This chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, that's not the whole story, but it has the salient details, I think. We read, and Jesus went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons. Now, after the raising of Jairus' daughter, there is something that reminds you of that. Chapter 6, verse 7, and he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. Look at that. Called the 12, sent out, have authority over demons or unclean spirits. So it looks to me like, if you look at that second pair of point and subpoint, disciples called, restoration from death, disciples sent. So you do have kind of twin callings. Alright, 4 called by the sea, 1 called by the sea, disciples called, disciples sent, 5,000 fed, 4,000 fed, on the way the Son of Man, on the way the Son of Man. Now, by the way, I realize, to me, it's very natural to think of the 5,000 being fed. Jesus was all the time calling people to table fellowship, so that is a kind of calling, Eucharistic calling, if you will. But I'm not going to, you have to see my commentary for more argument about that. Alright. So what does Mark do here then between the disciples being sent out and the feeding of the 5,000? Is there something he does as a special kind of compliment to Jairus' daughter being raised from death? I argued in the last video, and I argued also in my book, there just couldn't be a compliment to that, and there really can't be. There can't be another healing. If someone's restored to walk, you can restore someone else's hand. If a deaf mute's restored, you can restore a blind man. These are all complementary. You get a complete body, or you get a complete head that can both hear and speak and also see. But if you raise a girl from death, how do you move from there? Well, What we have in that space is the death of John the Baptizer. And watch this. In that story, Herod makes an offer on a special day, his birthday, and is tricked into promising to kill John. He did not want to kill John, but his stepdaughter, his lover's daughter, or whatever she was to him, like forgetting. I don't think they're actually married. That's what the whole point was. John was condemning him for taking his brother's wife. But anyway, he wants her to dance. She dances. He gets promises, and she asks for the death of John. She wants John's head on a platter. That leads to the second point. The feast of the day ends up being John on a platter. It's a feast day, it's a birthday, and John's head gets served up. I'm not saying it's eaten, but I'm just saying the imagery is really there and obvious and gross. All right. Third, Herod attributes a special power in the disciples to the resurrection of John the Baptizer. He hears about the 12 who've been sent out by Jesus. He hears about the special miracles they're doing, and he says that this means that John has been raised from the dead. Now, that's interesting. Finally, all this is told like in the past tense. It's recalling it. What happens is Herod attributes a special power. He hears about the disciples doing miracles, and he has this fear that John has risen from the dead. And then it goes to a flashback mode. And this flashback may have happened before the 12 were sent and before Jairus' daughter was raised, for all we know. So, let's think about that. Herod makes an offer on a special day and is tricked into promising to kill John. Pilate is tricked into handing over Jesus because he makes a special Passover promise to release either Jesus or Barabbas. Alright, Passover is a Jewish holiday and a biblical holiday. Pilate has a custom of promising to release one prisoner. He thinks he's going to get Jesus off the hook this way, but instead he has to release Barabbas, and he has therefore to kill Jesus. Interesting. The feast of the day ends up being John on a platter. Well, Jesus dying on the cross in the Gospels, always, it overshadows the whole Passover sacrifice. Interesting. Herod attributes a special power in the disciples to the resurrection of John the Baptist. Well, once Jesus is raised to new life and taken up into heaven, and once he sends the Spirit on Pentecost and power the church, they work miracles and they preach. So they go out. The whole Great Commission takes place. And finally, all this may have happened before the sending of the 12 and the daughter's resurrection, which puts us in a position where John seems to foreshadow Jesus' own death with his death, and Jairus' daughter foreshadows Jesus' resurrection, followed by the Great Commission to send out the disciples to preach and teach. The whole end of the gospel is kind of foreshadowed in this whole events, and these events with Jairus' daughter and John the Baptist's death possibly before that. So, what complements the restoration from death is the death of John the Baptizer. You have a death and a resurrection kind of corresponding to one another. And I believe that's how it all works out. So you have 4 called by the sea and the restoration to walk, 1 called by the sea and the restoration of the withered hand. Disciples are called, and there's then restoration from death in the climax of that cycle. And the complement is the disciples are sent, and we hear about the death of John the Baptizer. The 5,000 are fed, and we get the restoration of deaf mute. We get the 4,000 are fed. We get the restoration of blind man. We get on the way the Son of Man is going to suffer. Restoration of deaf mute. On the way the Son of Man is going to suffer. Restoration of the blind man. Well, that's it. It's obviously very brief. You can read more in my commentary of the Victory According to Mark. Though again, I've actually improved on the structure a little bit with understanding how it all worked with that the end of that second cycle. But still, it's a lot more argumentation is there, a lot more detail. Feedback, please. Handseyes.org. You can find the contact tab there. You can send me a message. Handseyes.org. Books. The Victory According to Mark, an exposition of the second gospel. You don't have to type all that in. You can just look at the tabs for books. And Handseyes.org. If you'd like me to stop doing this on a cheap netbook and actually get some real recording equipment, and you'd like to support this ministry in other ways, please feel free to be generous. I don't have at the time I'm recording this, I don't yet have an actual organization all tax exempt and everything, but I'm working on it, so please let me know. Well, God bless you all. This has been Hands and Eyes, and I hope to see you again sometime soon.